Really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I've always enjoyed greatly this event. It's not my first time, and I always look forward to it. So I'm going to talk today about creating and monetizing speed in blockchain. And I know NTU is very well known for its a mix of research and entrepreneurship. And as I go through this, I'll try to also illustrate some stories about how research shapes entrepreneurship and vice versa, how the kinds of problems that you encounter through entrepreneurship also shape your research and the things that you think about. So, trying to illustrate those synergies. So why do we care about speed and blockchain? Okay, great. Thank you. So generally, the decentralization that's sort of core to blockchain tends to be seen as a blocker to speed, right? I mean, the kind of speed that we see in DeFi is not the kind of speed that we're used to in TradFi, that we've come to expect in TradFi. So one of the approaches to try to counter this has been to basically re-centralize blockchain. So, co-location or in, the same data center or co-placement on fibers. So you're not maybe in the same center, but you're both on the same fiber. But to some extent, you can say that kind of pushes blockchain away from being blockchain. I remember when one of my kids was little, she would, sort of pretend to have two hands talk to each other. And I always feel it's a bit like that. It's like, hello, I'm machine one. Yes, I'm machine two. We agree. Yes, we've come to consensus. Like, yeah, but you're just the same machine. You're basically in the same room, and you're managed by the same people. How does this doesn't count? So there are real issues, and we can all disagree on this. I'd love to talk about it during the coffee break. But it definitely is a move away from basically the core element of the decentralization in blockchain. Now, one of the things is this is very much what we academics are taught to do, or maybe we do and then we naturally, and that's how we end up being academics, is we go back and see, why is this something that people believe? Is this true? Or does it come maybe from some assumptions about the current state of technology? For a long time, people would have assumed that if you wanted to, eat wheat or rice or whatever, you had to kind of live near the wheat or the rice field or whatever it may be. And that was an assumption because it was really hard to get stuff around. People create the wheel, and all of a sudden it's a lot easier to get around, right? It's just the technology has changed, and therefore it's changed the whole equations. And actually, we'll be talking a lot about equations today. So it's really important when we think, okay, well, if I want to have things be faster, maybe I have to give up on my decentralization. Why is that? And I'm going to argue that it's at least partially, I don't want to be too facile here, but it's at least partially something that's coming from obsolete technology, and I'll show how that technology is obsolete, and how, like so many things in technology, once you look at it mathematically, it's actually very different from what we expect. And in particular, the math that I'm going to share with you lightly, I know it's early in the morning, people only had one coffee. The math I'm going to share with you, it's about how we manage latency in an optimal way. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with trying to first make the case as to why we care about latency, right? Because I said, well, if you think that you're going to be in DeFi and it's kind of going to be a bit slow, then maybe I don't really care that much about latency. So I'm going to give you just an example, by no means supposed to be, at all exhaustive, but just to give you an example, particularly in Ethereum, of how you can actually monetize latency and why you care from a financial perspective in DeFi about latency. I think everybody knows in TradFi why you do care about latency, but I just want to illustrate how we care about latency in DeFi. And then I'm going to talk about, well, given that I do care about latency, how do I optimize it? How do I optimize it without giving up on the decentralization that I would argue is core to blockchain? And I'm going to give you two examples. One with Ethereum, which is where my example of monetization comes from. One in Ethereum, and in particular, I'm going to illustrate what we've been doing in our company, Optimum, with our product, Mom P2P, which is now on Ethereum mainnet, and I'll give you some notion of how it operates and also some of the numbers. And then I'm going to go and talk beyond Ethereum, how we can take these ideas and expand them more broadly across blockchain. So that's going to be sort of the core of the conversation. And then towards the end, I'm briefly going to try to engage in a conversation, which again I hope will then go into the coffee break, about how this means that you might be able to make a decentralized marketplace for latency. Basically a marketplace where you can freely onboard and sell your bandwidth to help everybody around you with their latency needs. Okay, so let's start with this example of, thank you, I have a feeling I have a relay, see that there who's helping. With this Ethereum exemplar. Next, please. Yeah. Okay. So just a very brief overview of Ethereum rewards, and with apologies, I know that there are people in the room who are experts on this, but it's just an example to get a feel of how these latency matters become financial matters. So, if you look at something like Ethereum, you have basically consensus layer rewards, and then you also have execution layer rewards. And basically, the total rewards come from the sum of these two, and some of them will be very connected to latency, and some of them less. And some of them may not seem that connected to latency, but actually are because of downstream effects. Okay. So if you look at the total reward, as I said, so some of the CL, so the consensus layer, and the EL, the execution layer. And you have items such as the attestations, the block proposals, and basically an earlier block reception, i.e. latency because of the earlier, it does increase your probability of attesting the block that will become the canonical head block. But basically what you're doing also when you're a proposer is you're incentivized because of your EL rewards to hold back the block as long as possible. But if you hold it back too long, you might basically miss your window. Okay, so you basically want to spend as much time as possible so that you can gather as many rewards as possible, but you do run the risk. And of course, different validators run very, very different kinds of strategies as to how they trade off between these two things, how aggressive they are, how much risk they want to take, that they basically hold too long, etc. So, that by itself, by the way, is a very, very interesting area of investigation, and certainly one that I have found fascinating in the course of actually looking at, how to monetize speed. Okay, but let's look at this little example just to illustrate what I'm talking about. So here are the bit arrival times. So this is milliseconds from the slot start. And here you have the different bit values in Ethereum. And maybe this is a little light, but the proposer cutoff is right here. So basically the proposer said, okay, the music stops here. I'm going to take the best bid, and this is my best bid. But had the proposer been able to wait just a little bit longer, right over here, and by the way, this is stylized, but it's actual data, this would have been actually the optimum thing. If they had been able to wait an extra 60 milliseconds, they would have seen something better. And, everybody here who's taking probability and so on, you'll recognize right away, this is an example of order statistics, right? The winner out of a race of n people is on average slower than the winner out of a race of n plus k people, right? Because you have more people, more contestants, and therefore it's more likely that the maps will be higher. So this is basically order statistics at work. And, these are just representative, again, they vary madly according to the location and other strategies that a validator will follow. But effectively, every, let's say, 15 milliseconds or so of additional time slot gives you an extra uplift in your rewards into the APR. Okay, so there is a lot of benefit to being able to go later, but to be able to go later without completely missing out, you would like to actually make your propagation downstream be faster. So here's an example basically of how you can take latency gains and in a DeFi environment, translate them into an APR uplift. So this basically goes into why you want to monetize latency. Now, okay, so it's desirable to reduce latency, not just for issues such as, user experience and so on, but also in order to be able to get a higher APR. How do I do that? I mean, people have been running these systems. They have been doing a lot of intelligent, sophisticated engineering and try to make these systems as efficient as possible. So what is it that you could actually do and, actually perform better? Well, there are a couple of approaches to it. One is you can try to just increase your bandwidth, right? So this is the throw money at the problem approach, which, sometimes that's all you can do. That is to say, okay, I'm going to buy a bunch of hardware or rent a bunch of hardware. I'm going to try to connect everybody to fiber. By the way, you better not be wherever you want to be in the world because there might not be fiber there. And you're going to have to pay for it, right? That's all you can do. That's all you can do, right? So you basically say, okay, I have a source. I'm going to have to divide the source among the different, I'm going to have to send to however many, so maybe there's a proposer, there's other validators. I'm going to have to send to however many validators I need to get to. And I'm just going to have to basically, fight delay with dollars and, swell my bandwidth by some factor alpha. Okay. That's one approach. Generally, you have some sort of hierarchical, either simple star, like I show here. That's basically what's in the Savannah turbine. Is not a star, but the next version rotor is monads. A raptor cast looks very much like that. Ethereum works a little bit differently. You have an unstructured mesh. Because it's more decentralized. I mean, this is basically, again, getting a little bit more centralized, right? Because you have to decide, you need to know exactly from the source which things you're talking to, rather than just, letting it flow freely in a truly decentralized fashion in the network. So the other approach, which is a totally unstructured mesh, gossip, is what is the approach that is taken by Ethereum. And what happens in this is that you have some multi-hop propagation where basically you have a source. The source doesn't know where the sinks are, so the proposer doesn't know where the attesters are going to be. It just sends out messages, and the messages propagate, and they make their way by hook or by crook to the different attesters. Okay. Now, the problem here becomes a problem, a trade-off of the following type. If the source does not send enough messages or shards of those messages, there's sort of not enough forward momentum propelling the information to the desired sinks. If, on the other hand, it sends a lot of it, you are more likely to get duplicate shards, and those duplicate shards are basically stealing the bandwidth and creating congestion. And as we know, because we've taken networking, the congestion effect is absolutely terrible, right? So If rho is the utilization level of my network, rho being between 0 and 1, 0 means nothing's happening, 1 is fully utilized, you know that the delay is going as rho over 1 minus rho. That means that as rho gets to 1, the whole thing is going to infinity. So we know that actually having that congestion from those extra shards is not just undesirable and wasteful, it actually can become a complete disaster. Okay, so the way we're going to do this instead is we're going to be doing it with coding, and many of you are familiar with this, but some of you may not be, so give me a minute or so to go over it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these shards, these pieces, which are described here for pieces 1 through 5, and in order to reconstruct the message, I need to reconstruct these shards like pieces of a puzzle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to represent these pieces as vectors in some appropriate number system, usually a finite field, Galois field, GF, and think of Q as being maybe like a prime, if that's, the easiest thing to think about, but generally we don't use primes, we use binary extension fields. And as long as I have a field size, that's to say a number representation system, which has enough choices, I have a lot of different possibilities for how I create equations. So binary is not by itself is not very good, but 0, 1, you only have 2 choices, right? So you don't have a lot of possible combinations and rich enough set of equations. But as long as I am working in a large enough field size, then basically what I can do is I can take these algebraic mixtures, I can create equations. I mentioned to you at the beginning that we'd be talking quite a bit about equations. I can create equations, and as long as I have 5 independent equations, I am able to recover the original 5 unknowns, which are the pieces. Okay. And then if you go, well, how am I going to create in a clever way these equations? My response is you're not going to be clever at all. You're going to choose them randomly. Now, a lot of people have, at best a quizzical look, sometimes downright, horrified look when I say we're going to do this randomly. It's like, well, isn't there a better way to do it than randomly? And the answer is, well, no, actually, there isn't. With probability going to 1, I can prove to you that there is actually no better way than to do it randomly. So, as reticent as we often are to say that, you're doing things randomly, it makes you sound like a complete slacker. It is actually optimally the right thing to do. So basically what's going to happen is we're going to take these random combinations, that's to say with random coefficients. And one of the great things about doing things randomly is if I take 2 randomly generated equations and then I randomly combine them, so with random coefficients, the output is also a randomly generated an equation which also has randomly generated coefficients. It's a bit like keeping your house really messy. No matter what, you can just do random things. It still remains a messy house. So that's basically what we're going to be doing here. Right? We're just going to keep it random. And this is very, very important because it means that you have the ability to compose. You have a legitimately correctly generated equation from input equations, which is not the way codes, where coding is basically the algebraic manipulation to represent data. Well, it's not the way that coding generally operates. Okay, generally people choose these coefficients very cleverly, and there's a lot of math that goes behind it. And here you're going to do this really in a very, very different way. So because you're doing things randomly, you don't need any sort of coordination. It's decentralized. Every node that sees equations coming in, and by the way, the original pieces are themselves equations, it just happen to be degenerate equations, is going to basically just randomly combine whatever equations it has at hand and transmit them to the other nodes. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's what we're going to be doing. And let's see what this does in Ethereum. So in Ethereum, as I mentioned, you're using Gossip. It's something called Gossip Sub or libp2p. They're actually essentially the same. So you publish a message, you send these pieces, and these pieces propagate, okay? And they use for transactional block propagation, and people use them for other things, state synchronization, peer discovery, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so it's a very commonly used setup. The decentralized solution is actually optimal, right? So I explained to you why, from an sort of intuitive perspective, it works with this randomization. But it actually has very, very strong properties. And in particular, you achieve, this is my former student, Bernhard Hoppler, he proved that this means that RNC Gossip achieves perfect pipelining. That is to say that even if you have a system that is changing in time, even if you have a system that's changing in time in an adversarial fashion, even if you had an omniscient, omnipotent controller that was able to see everything that's happening and predict everything that's going to happen and was trying to take the best remedial action, it would do no better on a, even not just an average case, but even a competitive case. It would never do better than just doing RLNC. Okay, so you can go and you can try to be really smart about it, or you can just be even smarter, just do the math and say, I'm not even going to care. Even if you told me the information, I just don't care. So it's extremely, extremely robust. So I mentioned that we are now on Ethereum mainnet, and here's some of the performance metrics. These are the network first-in ratio. So what the approach that we took, and this is one of the examples of taking the theory and bringing it into entrepreneurship. In theory, you go, well, I'm just going to replace whatever's out there in Ethereum. I'm going to do this. This is better. You can't just go and replace what's already in a protocol that's widely deployed, right? What you can do is you can make a sidecar. You can actually go ahead and say, hey, you know what? Why don't I supplement the native system? I will supplement the native system with this. And people will either get it from the native system first, or almost all of the time, they'll get it actually from our system, which is just this, completely decentralized system. It's still decentralized, but just using a non-obsolete technology. So this is where the non-obsolescence of the technology comes in. You get a large improvement range, you go much faster, and in particular, one of the things that's fantastic about coding is it reduces the average, and it really, really reduces the variance. And, we talked about latency. It's not just that latency is undesirable in financial systems. The uncertainty in latency is extremely undesirable, right? Because basically, I may increase, say, the mean by a factor of 2. But if I increase the standard deviation by a factor of 2, given that I'm going to have to give myself 2 or 3 standard deviations to be safe, probably more like 3, I've actually increased the overall weight because of the insurance I have to buy by, a factor of 6. So an increase in standard deviation is much worse than an increase in the mean for the same level of increase. So the fact that you really reduce the variance is extremely, extremely important. Okay, so here's some pictures. So here you can see what happens. So this is fresh off the presses. This is from our mainnet. So you can see these are measurements over a little over 21,000 Ethereum slots. And you can see here's the distribution with MonP2P, much lower median, and here's a distribution with libp2p. And the very, the small minority of times when you don't help with the coding is because actually you had an outlier behavior where you had a particularly low arrival time without the coding, right? I mean, even if you take a race of slow people and a race of fast people, there's still a probability that, the slow person will win. One of the cohorts of the slow people will win. right? It's a distribution. So it's not just that it helps, say, 90% of the time, but it's also that the few times when it doesn't help. And by the way, it never hurts, right? Because remember, you keep both systems going at the same time. The few times it doesn't help was because they actually didn't need any help anyway. You were doing great. Okay. And again, here you can see the big lowering in terms of the standard deviation. Okay, this is, similar data, but represented maybe in a way that's a little bit more familiar to us as communications and network engineers, which is the CDF, the cumulative distribution function. So here you see the propagation delay from first observer, and here's the observations reach. Of course, eventually you get to 100%, probably a 1 in your CDF. And you can see sort of these different cutoffs, right? So this is showing you, as I illustrated before, remember that, an extra 60 milliseconds would really be, come in very handy to benefit your APR. So here you can see how you can readily get that sort of level, right? So how you can buy, 50, 60, 100, maybe 150, depending on exactly what's going on. Levels of basically extra delay so that you can raise your APR. And you can see here the per slot network coverage percentile. You can see a huge difference here when you get to your P95. So the first part was, why do you want to help with latency? The second part is, how can you actually help with latency? What do you do on the technology side to help with latency? And how much does that help you? And the answer is, it helps you in a really, in a really massive and usable way. Okay, here's just a little bit more pictures. Here's a global arrival advantage. And you can see the percentage of slots that we accelerate over different geographies. Again, the geographies that tend to be a little bit more challenged tend to have higher gains. But even in extremely well connected geographies, and in particular Europe tends to be the most densely connected with a lot of direct fiber connections, you're still seeing about 80% of the time we benefit. Okay, so we've taken this technology, random network coding. I've illustrated to you what it can do in the context of Ethereum. But, can we go beyond Ethereum? Now, remember when I showed you that picture, I said, you can either try to do this in a structured way with some sort of, tree or star or some other hierarchical topology, or you could do it, the Ethereum way, which is just a gossip. But can I do better if I have a very structured system? It's not as obvious, right? You could say, well, a gossip was a little setup here with an arbitrary mesh, was a little bit messy. How about here? Here we understood that there would be these, duplicate wasteful shards that were going to create congestion and make my life a pain. But on the left, it looks pretty clean, doesn't it? You're like, well, they have a direct point-to-point link, and it's really fast. How are you going to do better than that, right? It seems like you couldn't, right? If I give you something this clean, it seems like you couldn't. Sure, I have to share my bandwidth. I have to share it among whatever the M sinks, the M receivers, the M attesters are. But, this doesn't look like you could benefit as much as over here. Here we understand, okay, it's a bit of a mess. Here it looks really clean. And the answer is yes, you can. So let me start by saying the following. Even in these systems, people use coding. And they use coding, erasure correcting coding, which means that you're correcting for things that were erased, which generally means that they didn't get there, which doesn't mean that they would never get there, just they didn't get there on time. So a shard might have gotten there eventually, but it didn't get there on time. People use coding. If you look at Solana, it uses Reed-Solomon coding. If you look at Monad, it uses Raptor codes. You could use a variety of other codes. And they dedicate a lot of their bandwidth to the redundancy in the coding, to the creation of these extra equations. To give you an example, in Solana, it's a rate 1/2 code, which means that half of the bandwidth is actually dedicated just to try to speed things up a little bit to make up for these slightly delayed arrivals, even on these, seemingly clean point-to-point links. They actually obviously are not point-to-point links, right? Just because I draw it as a point-to-point, we know that that's not the way it happens in reality, right? These are not point-to-point links. There's a whole bunch of routers and other things in between. Okay. Let me give you a very, very quick little taxonomy of coding. So one of the things you can do with your payload is you can leave it unsharded. So just blocks, not coded, just, you're basically transporting data, which is numbers, as though they were effectively, boxes of oranges, right? You're not making use of the fact that Galois has existed. You can take it and shard it, uncoded. So the orange here is indicating not coding. So if I have a rate lambda of arrival here of uncharted, I now have, I have a whole bunch of lower rates of these different types of shards. Here lambda over k, where k is my sharding rate. The next thing I can do after sharding is I can code. And there's two types of codes. There's the structured codes, such as, say, Reed-Solomon as an example, fixed rate. They tend to be what we call systematic codes, which means that you first send the data sharded and uncoded. So think of basically this is the original data, and then you send some extra data. So in this case, we have a total shard, you have a total number of n. So you shard it into k. You added n minus k redundant equations, okay, created usually with a very structured approach. And you have these different little individual rates, each of here lambda over n. Make sense? Okay. Ruthless code, like the Raptor code that I mentioned used in Monad, will basically just keep generating new equations, not always the same with the same recipe. I'm showing them in green there, until everything is received. And then RLNC, well, RLNC just does whatever all the time, right? I mean, it's random. So it's always green. Okay. One of the things that's interesting to think about is the following. If I look at these structured codes, they just happen to be a realization of funky, unusual, maybe improbable, but nonetheless absolutely permissible realization of a random code. So I can take something that had a structured code and recode it into something that had an unstructured code. So in particular, I can take whatever the native representation was, whether it was unsharded, sharded uncoded, sharded coded with a Reed-Solomon or with a Raptor code or what have you, and then I can combine it with an RLNC system and get something that's perfectly valid, right? And that's what we're going to do. All right? So my recoding, my recombination is code agnostic. This just happens to be a funny random code, but I know exactly what the coefficients are. I don't need to coordinate shards. The decentralization, which allows the scaling that I mentioned before, is still there. And the decoding, by the way, does not need to be in any way changed. The decoding, you're basically just gathering equations. So what do you do if you're gathering equations and you're trying to recover the original data? You make a matrix and you just run Gauss-Jordan elimination over it. How the matrix was created, you don't care. Whether it was created by a Reed-Solomon code, by a Bush-Chaudhary-Hockenheim code, by a random linear code, it's exactly the same mechanics. It's just very, very simple. It's basically sophomore level linear algebra, except in a finite field. Okay, so here's an example of what happens. Now, this is an example. I said I would mention to you something where the work happening basically on the entrepreneurial side sort of generated a really interesting research problem. So I struggled with this for a long time. because I thought, okay, I have a random code. I'm going to try to combine it with Reed-Solomon code. I'm going to have these different kinds of equations. I could try to figure out, what is going to be at fine granularity, the distribution of the coefficients in my matrix. And very quickly, you can see that it just becomes a complete nightmare from, a combinatorial perspective. It's just not going to happen. So the other approach is to go, you know what? Really what coding does is it turns the data and it just makes it into a fluid. So let's think of this in a more fluid kind of way. So what happens when I have a code here, whatever code may be? When I have a probability P basically of getting through, remember, I have a probability that I'm going to be delayed. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been bothering coding in something like, for instance, Solana. Let me look at the fraction of nodes which hold at least I unique shards or equations, okay, at any time step s. And let me simplify this by thinking that there is a regular clock, which of course there isn't, everything's asynchronous. How would I make this into a discrete time fluid approximation? Well, basically what happens is I'm getting data from the source, so I have the fraction at time s plus 1 of the nodes that have at least I degrees of freedom is the same as at the previous time, plus all of the ones that were 1 degree of freedom shy, so Fi and Fi minus I minus 1, basically those are the ones that had exactly I minus 1, because it's the ones that had at least I minus 1 minus the ones that had already I. So this is the ones that had I, and they got augmented with a fluid push of P, which is the probability of getting through, alpha, which is how much I boosted my bandwidth. And by the way, how did I boost my bandwidth? By throwing money at it. Think fiber, right? I threw a bunch of money at it, and that's how I boosted my alpha. And of course, I have to share my bandwidth from the source among the different sinks, so divide by m. So it's a fluid approximation. It's actually an upper bound to what would happen if you were doing Reed-Solomon code or uncoded or something like that. So I'm being generous to the legacy technology. And then what do I see here? I see basically this heat map of how things are progressing, how degrees of freedom are progressing. So down the abscissa here, you have the number of time steps, S. It's not seconds, it's this number of time steps. And here's the number of unique shards. So in something like Solana, you use a 3264. So you shard into 32, and then you have a rate 1/2. So you add an extra 32 equations. And what you're seeing here is this basically advancing wall of blue. Blue means where advancing wall of yellow. Yellow means that everybody got everything. And I want to get to at least this green, to at least 2/3, right? Because remember, 2/3 is sort of the magical level at which you achieve consensus. So I want to get to at least this 2/3. Does it make sense what this heat map looks like? Right? It's a very visual, simple view. So you can see basically that, you have this, you start at blue, nobody has enough, and you're trying to get to the point where the number of people who have at least 32, which means that they can decode, are getting, in the green area of at least 2/3. What happens when I add RLNC? Well, what can I add RLNC? This already shows what would happen if there was RLNC at the source. So here's again when you go back and you say, let's change the assumptions. Why do I have a star? Who told me I should have a star? Nobody said that. It's not like these nodes don't know how to talk to each other. I mean, right now, this is the proposer, but whatever, some slots from now, this will be the proposer. It's not like the proposer doesn't get to talk to the other people. Everybody's connected to everybody else. It might not be with fiber, it might be with a very weak link, but everybody's connected to everybody else, correct? So why can't they talk to each other? Nobody said they can't. Yeah, let them talk to each other. That's what we're going to do. We're going to let the sinks talk to each other and very likely just exchange equations. And this is where the recoding comes in. Maybe they got a Reed-Solomon coded shard. They're going to recode with some other Reed-Solomon coded shards, and they're going to send it out as an RLNC shard. And now they're helping each other out. So you have an extra term that shows up in this fluid approximation. This is the help that they're getting, the mutual help, the mutual reciprocal assistance that they're giving each other. Now, there is no coordination here. None of these nodes is talking to the other to figure out what they have or what they don't have. If you had that, you would have an absolute nightmare, right? Because you basically would need to go back to having a centralized system. And not only would you have a centralized system, you have a centralized system that is just incredibly onerous and not working. Okay? So each of these white nodes is taking whatever equations it got from the source, recombining them, and telling everybody else what's happening. Now let's go back to this issue I mentioned earlier of order statistics, right? Normally what would happen is the first 2/3 of these validators would be the ones that basically win the race, right? The ones that got there faster. If we now help each other out and basically update each other with equations, whoever was winning the race in terms of equations, in terms of degrees of freedom, can get everybody else to catch up. So it's like magically, you're turning every single node in being effectively a winner to be as good as whoever was the node that happened to be, by happenstance or better connectivity or what it may be, to be the one that was furthest ahead. They're helping each other, they're equalizing, and they're getting each other to be further ahead. So now what happens? You have this very, very sharp transition from not knowing to knowing. Remember the green part that was there before, that green smudging, which was, you now have a fraction. It's like you don't know, and then bam, all of a sudden you know. But also you can remember that the yellow part here, which was, much further down, has now moved to much earlier. Everybody's just helping each other out. And this extra term, which is basically just the term of the things I'm getting from the other nodes that are also trying to receive. Very quickly, this becomes dominant. Why? Because this is the stuff that came from the previous time. This is the stuff that's coming at this time from the source, but this becomes very small. Very quickly, this is the dominant term because M is large, right? You don't talk to two. Yes?
The previous slide, you said the lower values, there were some assumptions, I guess, for example, for Savannah. Do you? Thank you. In this slide, do you still do the same assumptions?
Yeah. So it's actually not synchrony. It's just that you're discretizing the time steps, but you're not synchronizing. So there's no synchrony. And actually, because it's a fluid approximation, that takes into account the fact that this is to complete a synchrony. You don't know when things are coming there. You're just basically making the whole thing fluid. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great question. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Sorry, I think this got cut off, but this is the this is the FIS+1. Sorry, I think it just got cut off. Make sense? Okay. More questions on this? Stop me anytime. Okay. So here's again sort of this a little bit kind of a CDF looking. It's not a CDF, but looking cumulative representation. What you can see is this is if I bump up the fiber basically by 50 times more bandwidth, 100 times more bandwidth, 250 times more bandwidth, 500 times more bandwidth. Again, remember, money, you're spending money. It's going down the drain, okay? It'll go faster. But basically what you can see is rather than, we're calling this turbo, by the way, it's not like turbo coding like the traditional, Beru, Glavio, Titimajima network coding. I'm calling it turbo because you're using degrees of freedom which were basically already in your system and you're recirculating them like you would in a turbo engine, right? So you're taking things that are already in the system, recirculating to make it go faster. Basically what happens here is, you would have been better off using, having a much lower multiplier of your bandwidth and just using a little bit of math rather. So for instance, here you can see than actually just throwing money at it. So the dashed is without turbo. So here's the blue dashed when you did 50, and here's the blue with turbo, which is better than the 250 without turbo. Right. So you could have saved yourself 5 times the money on your bandwidth by just putting in a bit of math. Math is cheap. Okay, all you need to do is drink a bit of coffee, out it comes, and then it's reusable, it's cheap, it's environmentally friendly. I highly recommend using math rather than throwing hardware and stuff, but as much as possible. And in terms of the scaling, as you increase this M, this number of nodes at basically the receiving nodes, as you increase M, the gap becomes absolutely massive. Okay, so this is with turbo, without turbo. Again, the dash is without turbo. You can see that if I had 5,000, I don't even know, this would be somewhere, outside in the garden. With 1,000, you can see it here. With 500, with 10, of course, but that's a very moderate, very, very small size. So any sort of sizable number of nodes in your system, say 500, what you can see is, again, a massive gap. It's like you just cannot scale if you don't do the coding correctly. Sometimes people say, well, what, can I get away with the Reed-Solomon code? Is it 10% worse? Is it 15% worse? Is it 20% worse? Maybe it's even 50% worse. I said, it's not that. It's that as your number of nodes increases, it's worse exponentially in the number of nodes. It's infinitely worse. It's not, okay, well, I know I'm using slightly older technology, but can I get away with it? No, you really can't. You really can't. One of the things that's also interesting is that now, because remember, every node is helping everybody else basically get to the level of the winning node. Now, even if only a fraction of the nodes have high bandwidth, it's as though they magically made the other nodes who didn't have a high bandwidth from the proposer, from the source, look like they have a high bandwidth. Make sense? Right? Because, yeah, maybe I didn't have a lot of bandwidth from the source, but guess what? My neighbors are all helping me. So effectively, what would happen here is that fiber peers without turbo, without helping each other, would decode after about 700 steps. Without fiber, the ones that are bandwidth challenged would require like 10,000 steps. It's like a 14x gap. But here, they're helping each other out. The ones that have fiber are still better off. They're better off by, basically 150 steps versus 700 steps. So they're happier. But look at the ones without fiber. They're basically also decoding at 150 steps. Everybody helped everybody out. The riches of everybody are just, magically shared, and it's not a zero-sum game because it's coding. Okay? They're not competing with each other. Okay. So what have we seen so far? So we've talked about why it's important to monetize latency, or why, there's really very rich possibilities to monetize latency. But in order to monetize that latency, you first have to be able to create the possibility to get better latency, both in terms of mean, but also in terms of standard deviation. I've shown you product which is now in in deployment on Ethereum on P2EP. By the way, I think as of a day ago, we had about 1.5 billion total value boost. I'm looking at my co-founder, who, by the way, proud Kent Lind, proud NTU alum, standing there. Yeah, just wanted to call you and put you on the spot. So, I've shown you, how you can do this in practice. I've shown you how it's not limited to systems that you might think are particularly challenged, like Ethereum, because of the decentralized and highly messy topologies. But even for the most, radically simple topologies like you would find in Solana and Monad. Let's think a little bit about what this means going further on. Okay. I have a system where the different nodes are basically coding, so ingesting equations and putting equations out, right? So what these nodes were doing here is they were taking equations from the source, and then they were sharing equations with each other and helping each other out. So they were better off, but how do I incentivize people to do this? Why should I help people out? Well, it helps me, but maybe it helps them more than it helps me. Maybe they want it more than I want it. Who knows, right? Maybe the people here who had basically less of a gap don't want to help as much as people who had a gap. There's a price to that. So now that I have this approach, which is an approach basically where the coding has turned everything into a fluid, right? And this gets back to the question about the synchronization. There's no synchronization. It's all fluid. Maybe I can just have nodes, which we call flex nodes, because they could be large, they could be small. You could have a lot of bandwidth to resell, you could have little bandwidth to resell. And what they're doing is they're basically just selling their latency to whoever can use it. We talked about validators, but obviously MEV searchers, obviously traders, and they can sell it, and they can make a market where they sell each other whatever they have, these equations. These might be equations that maybe they wanted anyway. Maybe you were a validator and you were going to, acquire these equations anyway because you needed to. And now you're just reselling equations to help others out. Maybe not. Maybe you're just buying them actually from validators or other nodes who are just in the business of not forwarding, but recoding. It's very different to forward and to recode. Forwarding is what happens in Gossip Sub versus recoding, which is what happens in MomTUP. So you can imagine basically something where you have real responsiveness, a market value of latency. You have a highly decentralized, low latency network. And remember that optimum basically pipelining that I talked about, that Bernhard told us about. That's basically what's happening here. I don't care what the network topology is. When people sometimes say, well, what's the optimum graph? I said, the optimum topology is whatever resources you have, just use them and just get the lowest latency out of that set of resources. That's it. Just use whatever you have. Then you can decide whether you want to pay more or whatever, but just use whatever you have. And you're basically just optimizing automatically. So you're self-optimizing for a network efficiency without the need to have a coordination, without the need to have a centralization, without the need to be in the same room and talk to yourself, right? Basically, that's what you're doing. So I want to leave you with that thought. I think it's a really attractive thought when we think of, decentralized finance, that you can not just decentralize your compute, but that you can also decentralize the provisioning of the bandwidth that makes that compute work. Okay. And with that, I encourage you to explore Optimum, and I look forward to questions and also conversations at the coffee and a tea break afterwards. Thank you very much. Thank you. Are there questions? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So yeah, I find it's a brilliant idea applied random network coding in the block, the propagation case, because I think that's exactly the strength of the random network coding. But on the other hand, so I'm the security person.
Yes.
So random network coding allows the nodes to recode right in the middle. So do you have any consideration in your system for the potential poisoning attack?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So we have solutions for this Byzantine attacks where you have somebody inject a bad equations. There are a few different ways of dealing with. I mean, first of all, you can detect very quickly at decoding time, and the idea is just to geek out a little bit. These are linear equations over a large field. We don't have to, like in a security setting, have to be in a large prime field. We generally are, as I said, in a binary extension field. But basically, the insight from large prime fields carries over. So the idea is, because you have a polynomial, if you put in a polynomial hash, the probability that somebody, upon poisoning, because they're random equations, so you don't know exactly what's going to come out, upon poisoning an equation, will be able to hit one of the roots in the polynomial hash is very low. So this is the detection when you decode. You can tell which one that you can, first of all, immediately detect that something went wrong. Okay. Now, if you want to correct, right, you can actually have an error correction code, and the recoding with RLNC maintains the error correction. So that's what subspace codes, that whole area of subspace codes, does. If instead you don't want to detect or just correct at the receiver, but you want to prevent any propagation of even in a one-hop basis, it turns out you can do homomorphic encryption. And it's not like full homomorphic encryption, which is, horrible and scary and expensive and so on. It's only linear coding homomorphic. So the idea is you can, without knowing what a vector is in a large field, you can see whether it is the vector that it says it is in that field. So what you can do is you can effectively use something very simple, Diffie-Hellman discrete log problem, and you can homomorphically detect if something has been
your how does those security measures impact your latency?
It doesn't. It doesn't. It's pretty orthogonal. So we've done studies on that. I'd be happy to send you some of the. Yeah,
okay,
that's a great question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? I think there was another question. Yes.
Thank you for the great talk.
Thank you.
If we go back to the history of Ethereum in particular, it used to be congested at times, and that led to a lot of layer 2 solutions, which is pretty much reducing the traffic by doing things off-chain rather than on-chain. Now I understand the traffic is probably low because Ethereum would be congested otherwise. Something you didn't discuss is the effect of congestions. Like, for example, what could be the throughput that you could achieve?
Yeah.
You focus essentially on latency. I would be interested in any throughput result.
Yeah, the effect of congestion is very interesting. So you're correct that I didn't touch upon it here because, there wasn't enough time. I hinted at it a little bit, right? So if you lower the congestion by not having, my time is up, I got it. So let me finish this answer, but yes, thank you. If you lower the congestion, so remember that formula I mentioned, the rho over 1 minus rho, right? So a 10% lowering, maybe because you didn't send duplicate shards, has a disproportionate effect upon the delay with the congestion, right? So the congestion, which is basically the queue size, goes with the delay, right? So whether it's 1 over 1 minus rho, rho over 1 minus rho, depending on which of the two you're looking at, that is the effect. So you're correct that I didn't talk about it, but I actually have a talk on basically that, which I spared you today.
I would be interested to know more.
I'd love to. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And that's it, folks. Okay. Thank you.